This session, like you're aware, has been designed to look at the issues surrounding inspection, monitoring, and compliance, which I think a number of us, we agree with me that is still an issue in our occupational and safety practice in Africa. Not just that we are, our OSH and labor inspectors are under-resourced. I think the needed competency, to do excellent job, it still lags in a whole lot of ways. And in trying to bridge this gap, we at OSHAfrica realize there is need to keep scaling up the existing knowledge, building upon all that we're given in our local Ministry of Labor, and seeing how we can do better job. You will agree with me that the more competent OSH and labor inspectors we have, the better and the safer our workplaces could be. And this was that was one of the reasons why this webinar and the topic in question became very critical to us. You may also be aware of the fact that OSHAfrica just concluded 7 weeks of intensive training of labor inspectors across about 14 countries lately. And that was a 7 weeks online training that we did in partnership with Workplace Set Without Borders Canada. And what we're also looking at is still the same issue of labor inspection. How do we improve their competencies? How do we improve their competencies? And seeing how they can perform better in their workplaces. So today we'll be looking at that issue critically and looking at what is happening across different regions. For me, I think it is better to learn from a number of countries that have got this right and see how we can take a lead for, what they did. We don't need to reinvent the way. What were those things they did right, they got right, that took them to where they are today? Let's take it from there and also build a better system for our people. The people that work in these workplaces, they are either our brothers, our sisters, our uncles, or our aunts. The need to protect them is our moral responsibility. Hence, this has become very crucial to us. Before we start this meeting, before we introduce the speaker, we invite Dr. Tutula Bafo, one of the board members of OSHAfrica, to say a few words before we start. Tutula, are you still here?
Good evening or good day, colleagues, in case some of you are not in the evening. It's a pity I can't show my face. We have got load shedding, which is something that is getting more common in South Africa. But I would like to welcome everyone to the webinar and particularly thank Ehi, for organizing. This is part of the series of webinars that we are organizing as OSHAfrica. And we had said that we would have quarterly webinars, and I think we are doing well thus far. We did have a previous webinar in collaboration with the asbestos colleagues. And so this one is also a very important webinar on compliance. I would like to particularly welcome Samantha Peace and thank her for being available to talk to us on compliance, monitoring, and enforcement. And actually, in our survey, this was a topic that came through very high in terms of priority that needs to be addressed. So Samantha, I hope that everyone will get a lot of value from your presentation, and that we will all, that is, I'm now talking to the inspectors, that they will actually be able to utilize some of your advice. So thank you very much and all the best for our webinar.
Thank you so much, Tutula. We really appreciate that. Okay, to the crux of the matter. We have with us a very respected, renowned, and dependable colleague of ours. When we're talking about setting up this webinar, we didn't know who to use. We had to go to IALI, International Association of Labor Inspectors, who we're also partnering with in Africa. And they were very generous enough to point us at Samantha's direction. I had a very, very wonderful conversation with her yesterday, and I realized we got the best hand to talk to us today. Samantha, I'll just read her brief profile. She joined the Health and Safety Executive, HSE, Great Britain's Occupational Health and Safety National Regulator in 1995 as a factory inspector in London and the East of London, dealing with a wide range of industry sectors. Samantha has held various roles within the organization, including responsibility for operational policy and European standard development for selected manufacturing industries. In 2002, Samantha obtained a master's degree in occupational health and safety and environmental law. She has since held a number of senior managerial and operational delivery positions in health and safety executive field operations division. Samantha was promoted to the senior civil service in 2013, and in May 2016 took over as the director of field operations, responsible for inspection, investigation, and enforcement activity of all health and safety executive regulated industries, excluding construction and major hazards. Samantha leads a division of around 650 people, both inspectors and administrative support, based in 25 locations across Great Britain, and has experience of conducting international assessment of labor inspectorates as a member of Senior Labor Inspectors Committee, European team. Samantha is an executive member of the International Association of Labor Inspectors, IALI, and an IALI International Assessor. Samantha led the IALI team that conducted the first international benchmarking OSH regulations assessment of the Malaysian Inspectorate. Samantha, ladies and gentlemen, if you can, in a loud ovation, please help me welcome Samantha. Samantha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's wonderful. It was mentioned that I have responsibility at the moment for everything except major hazards and construction, but in fact, I spent 7 years inspecting the construction industry. So I do have a background there as well, even though I don't actually have the teams that do that anymore. So let me share my screen with you, if I may, so I can take you through this. Let's share this. Hopefully everybody can see that. Good. Okay. So I imagine that all of the people on this call have within their labour inspectorate a huge range of things that they may be responsible for dealing with. In my experience across a number of countries, you know, there really is quite a variation in what inspectors are given the task of dealing with. In the UK, we have a dedicated regulator. The regulator I work for is principally there for occupational safety and health, accident investigation. We do some work in working time, but generally speaking, the other matters of wages and other employment matters are dealt with by other regulators. I know that in quite a number of countries, those issues are all combined together. And actually, inspectors have quite a big remit that they're doing, and some of you, no doubt, have those responsibilities. So interesting that there's quite a range of issues that you might be dealing with, but whatever those issues are that you're dealing with, some of the core activities of actually going out and conducting the work to inspect those issues have the same core principles regardless of where you are in the globe. And it's quite interesting because as I've gone to look at the Irish system, and I've done some research into the US system, and indeed the Malaysian system that we assessed, there is some real commonality across the globe about the way in which good labour inspection takes place. And I think one of the things I'll come on to a little bit later is some of the standards that IALI have produced, similar to European and International Labour Organization standards, can be really helpful to inspectors to understand the sort of standards to operate to, the kind of ways in which we're expected to operate as labour inspectors. And in fact, yesterday, just to remind myself of what the world is like, I was actually out inspecting premises with one of my inspectors and dealing with health, watching them deal with health issues, watching them enforce. So really, you know, it's nice to get back out there in the real world. One of the most important things for us all is that you're a very precious resource as a labour inspector. I think he mentioned at the beginning that there are not enough of us. There rarely are. I haven't yet been to a country where actually everybody felt there were as many labour inspectors as were perhaps needed for the millions of businesses and all the risks that those businesses create. So going to the right places in the first place is terribly important for us. Having a labour inspectorate around us that actually makes sure that your precious resource is devoted to the biggest risks, or devoted in the case of major hazards, if that's something you work in, it might be quite low risk, but it's very high hazard. It goes wrong rarely, but when it goes wrong, it can kill hundreds, if not thousands of people. So really important that inspectors are focused on those sort of key risks. Most of the labour inspectorates I've encountered respond with data that they marshal together in terms of reports of imminent danger if something is brought to our attention, incident reports. Most organisations, most countries have systems where people have to report certain things to the labour inspectorate so that the labour inspectorate can decide whether or not they are something that they want to respond to. There should be a route for the workers out there, the vulnerable people out there, those who don't have a voice, those whose employer are not listening to them, are not responding to them, to be able to come to the labour inspector with those concerns so that we can go out and do something about them. And the best, work very closely with other regulators. Certainly in the UK, we sometimes do combined inspections. So we will go in with the Environment Agency who are trying to protect the environment, and we will conduct joint inspections with them so that there's no conflict between the regulators, there's no conflict for the business, and we can all make it really clear what we expect from them. In terms of inspection programs, again, it's really important that inspectors and everybody else in the organisation, if they have a slightly different role, and there are many different ways in which the inspection capability is structured in different countries. But however it's structured, it's really important that there are ways of deciding what the priorities are. And this is just a couple of examples here. In the UK, the image you see there is from a system that we call Find It in the UK. So we as a regulator bring together an awful lot of data from an awful lot of sources in order to decide and evaluate what the important priorities are. Where is the harm happening? Where are the risks? What are the priorities for our inspectors? And I note that the USA has a similar thing. It has national emphasis programs that focus on particular hazards and high hazard industries and activities, and it has local emphasis programs because sometimes industries are regionally based, they're not necessarily everywhere, and so, but they might be worthy of attention, and so they are crafting that. Whatever the Labour Inspectorate's organisation, it's important that those programs are designed so that the inspections that the whole inspectorate is putting the effort into doing are organised so that you can actually not only reduce the risk, but achieve a really good underlying improvement in the management of risk. So for example, in the UK at the moment, we are focusing on fabricated metals as an industry, and the waste and recycling industry and the agricultural industry, all of which have very high levels of harm, very high health risks, cause some significant issues. So they're a focus of our attention. and we put the effort across the inspectorate into making sure that we're trying to tackle that risk and achieving a fundamentally good improvement in those industries over as short a period of time as we can. So when we're going out there and we want to take that action, we're conducting those inspections or those investigations, these are the areas that are really important for all of us as inspectors, as labour inspectors. So I just want to run through these in a bit more depth, each of them. But the context of that is that actually we need really good training. He mentioned at the beginning, there's 7 weeks training that's been done for some inspectors by OSHAfrica, which I think is a really important move. IALI has pulled together a really good competency framework for inspectors. And you can see that there are broad-based competencies. This is just an extract from the document, and I'll give you the link at the end. There are broad-based skills and competencies that every inspector has, and it divides it up into different levels. So you can see the descriptors from the basic level, moving up to the intermediate level and advanced. You know, it's about inspectors being exposed to different levels of complexity. So you may go out and you may inspect or investigate something that is relatively straightforward. It's a small business, it's a fairly confined event, or you may end up having to deal with something really complex and being in a position to have to make some quite difficult decisions without necessarily all of the information that you might ideally like as an inspector to make that decision. So it's important that inspectors are given the fundamental training for these skills and then have a good programme within their labour inspectorate of how that skill is going to be developed over a period of time. And as well as the more broad-based competencies, it's really important that inspectors also have the technical competencies they need. And I can see from the descriptions of the jobs people are doing, some of you are physicians, some of you are really highly specialised in what you do, and you will have that element of it. And it may well be that the knowledge and skills that you require to match that, maybe the regulatory decision making, the serving of notices, the sanctions, dealing with that side of things. So technical competency, really important. Investigative skills, including some kind of methodologies and things, different ways to approach investigations, understanding that, working right up to the advanced levels, and being able to, you know, use the latest practices and understand what those are and be keeping up with those. So, as I say, I'll give you the link at the end to this, but if you're an inspector, particularly if you're in the early days of learning the craft of inspection, really worthwhile having a look at the competency framework and having a think about where you sit on that and what you might want from your organisation in terms of further training, both on the job and in the classroom, to get you up to the right place for the job that you're being asked to do in particular. Okay, so working through some of the areas that that I mentioned at the beginning, the powers that inspectors have across the globe vary quite substantially. In Japan, for example, there's the labour inspectors have rights to arrest people for the offences they may be committing, but the International Labour Organization and certainly organizations like IALI would say that these are probably the 3 basic areas where all inspectors require these powers in order to do their job. So certainly the right to enter any workplace that falls within the law of your country freely and without notice, unannounced if you wish to. In the UK, certainly we enter at what's called any reasonable time, and that means whenever work is happening. And it's important because there are some environments, whether it's a hospital or bakeries, where things go on at odd times, and you need to be able to go in, or they're 24-hour operations, whether that's mining. I don't know whether that goes on for 24 hours, it may do, but certainly, you know, the big chemical plants and so on, they're 24-hour enterprises. So you need to be able to go in as a labour inspector at any time of the day or night to do what it is you need to do. The second bullet, really important, you need to be able to have powers to interview people, to require them to produce documents for you, to take samples, to order things to be left undisturbed if you want to. And you need to have the right powers to take enforcement action, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. This is important, and the way it works is important. I think in some countries it's more difficult perhaps to get those rights to enter in that way, but it's important to be able to see what's really happening in a workplace, to make sure that you've got that authority to go in and to do what you need to do. Understanding the law, you come from a whole host of different countries, and the law is quite different, and the scope, the number of workplaces your law may cover will be different in different countries. But the biggest difference usually the biggest difference across the globe, and it may be in quite a number of the countries that you're in, is whether the law is goal setting, whether it's sort of risk-based, it's preventive, but allows for discretion, it allows for development of different standards of protection and controls for health and safety, or whether it's highly prescriptive and very defined. It's really interesting because even if you have a more general duty, that can be more difficult to apply. My understanding in the USA, for example, is that you've got quite a lot of OSHA standards, and those are applied very, very clearly. There's a general duty too, but if there isn't really a standard to go with it, that can be quite challenging to deal with and to enforce in law. In the UK, and similar legislation has been adopted in Malaysia, and certainly in Ireland, the law is very much goal setting. It says that the employer will do what is reasonably practicable to reduce the risks, to prevent either their own employees or others affected by their work being exposed to the risks that they create. So it's very goal setting, but that means for a labour inspector, you need to look for benchmarks and standards, which I'll come on to, but it does allow for innovation. It allows businesses, it allows organisations, it allows for innovation, and it's a lot less difficult to keep that law relevant and up to date than it can be if it's highly prescriptive and highly defined, which can be much more difficult to deal with. It can bring great clarity for some things, however, but it can be much more difficult as a labour inspector to sort of keep pace with all of that level of prescription. Some of the laws across the nations, all of them pretty much put responsibilities on businesses, on organisations, on employers. Little bit more variation about the nature of the legal responsibilities of individuals for health and safety. The law in Malaysia in terms of directors is a bit stricter actually than the law in the UK, in placing very clear responsibilities on those who are in control of the companies, which is a healthy thing. There are responsibilities, similar legal responsibilities in UK law, for example, but they operate slightly differently in the two countries in the way that they have been cast. But it's important, I think, in any country that the health safety law and the other laws that are relevant to the labour inspectorate do make sure they're very clear about what the responsibilities are on the employer and on organisations and what the responsibilities are of individuals. For the most part, with the individuals, it's about the employees cooperating with their employers, and working with their employers in order to get matters right and to achieve the right level of protection. But labour inspectors should receive quite good training in the law. You can't carry it all in your head when you're going out and you're doing your inspections and you're doing the investigations. So it's also important you have tools so you can be able to access that guidance and that advice and that information when you're out and about doing the work that you're doing. For inspection, really good preparation is required for visits, and there should be a set standard operating procedure. In the countries I've visited, there's always a very clear written procedure about how inspections should be conducted, what an inspection consists of. That's particularly important in countries where there may be employee representatives or where there is some unionisation. That may not be a particularly high feature in some countries, but in others, you know, it's terribly important that the workforce gets spoken to. If they have representatives, those representatives are spoken to. It's also important then that what the inspector sees and what the inspector does about what they see is actually captured. in reports, because the best intelligence about what's happening in the world and how good the standards are in the world is the judgment of an inspector with visits that they may have done and the action they may have taken. And obviously, employers have to be informed of exactly what's going to happen to them, why it's happening, why they are or not complying with the law, what the inspector is going to do about it, what they expect the employer and the business to do, and what that kind of follow-up will look like. And it's important to think about how the inspection is approached as well. You may have particular approaches in your countries. The International Labour Organization are very clear that labour inspectorates should not refrain from limiting inspections to certain areas or pre-established checklists. Checklists can be really helpful, and they can be quite a useful way of making sure one doesn't miss essentials if you're particularly running a campaign or a program on a particular activity or risk. So, for example, we did one where it was about Legionella. There's quite a lot to remember about controlling the risk to people's health from Legionella. So there was a kind of really good list of things that people had to work, the inspectors had to work their way through when they were conducting those inspections. But by and large, the intention is not to restrict the inspector. And it's important not to set a time limit on the time that people can take to do the inspections. We will all know, and I'm sure many of you know, that when you go out trying to conduct an inspection of a small woodworking shop is with 2 or 3 people working on it, might only take you an hour or so. Conducting an inspection, however, of an offshore platform or a huge manufacturing plant is going to take you a great deal longer. So certainly it's important, and around the world, my experience is that by and large, people are not limiting the amount of time that the inspectors can take to conduct their inspections. They take what's needed to deal with the key risks that they're seeing. And that's the other issue about testing. Testing, the inspectors there to test the ability of the company to actually manage risks that they're creating, whatever those may look like. The picture illustrates the risk from silica dust, and we would expect, it wasn't on there, but we would expect dust suppression, we would expect water suppression on that tool with what that man is doing there, rather than having that silica dust going up through his air zones and breathing it in. So it's important that we do it when we go in systematically into an organisation, that we test using the things that we know are probably the most important things in that industry. So if I'm going into the waste and recycling industry, I'm going to be really looking to see how they isolate machinery when they go in to clear blockages or do things, because I know that's the thing that most kills and maims people in the waste and recycling industry. So you test the organisation's management and their ability to actually deal with things in that way. Investigation, again, some inspectorates, and you'll know what happens with yours, some have duties to investigate certain things, but the vast majority have powers to investigate rather than duties. So they don't necessarily investigate everything, because it may not be possible to investigate everything that is reported or everything that is happening out there, because there just aren't enough labour inspectors to do that. So we have to make some choices. So the vast majority of labour inspectorates will set some criteria about the sorts of things that they will and won't investigate, leaving a bit of wriggle room to make some choices about things if they need to. And obviously, it's important then again that there is a good process and a good procedure, and everybody understands what an investigation should consist of, and what the purposes of that investigation actually are. In most cases, the purpose is to gather information, establish, identify the immediate cause and underlying causes and the lessons to be learnt, identify any breaches of the law, and obviously respond to that in the way that is thought most appropriate. I thought it might be interesting just to show you, and this is important when we were talking about training of inspectors and complexity, investigating an injury to maybe a finger chopped off on a machine is one thing. Investigating something like this was a wood treatment manufacturing plant. It used wood chip to make products, and suffered a dust explosion, and 4 people were killed in this explosion. And it took a lot of forensic examination, and both the Labour Inspectorate in the UK worked with the police, and specialist inspectors, both mechanical and electrical, actually getting involved in order to try and determine the cause of the incident. Hugely complex physical site, hugely complex investigation. And you would need a very experienced Labour inspector who understood how to manage that kind of scale of investigation, the expert testimony, how to gather that evidence and make sure it's admissible for whatever court process you may have in your country, in order to hold the organisations and or any individuals accountable following the investigation. So clear rules and procedures for that are really important. Some of the challenges around that, especially in the modern era, I'm sure we're all finding, is that sometimes the witnesses are not people who are necessarily located in the country, and witnesses, our experiences may have dispersed or disappeared. It can be quite hard to do that. But you know, the reports and the decisions then on action, capturing that again very, very cleanly, and making sure that all the decisions that are taken on the action is really important. It's another picture of another one, the construction site where fall from height resulted in a death, which was later prosecuted. So enforcement, and there's a specific question. I'm going to come on to the different tools that different countries use for enforcement. The International Labour Organization states that labour law enforcement, compelling compliance with rules and regulations, is one of the primary responsibilities of labour inspectors. I think the thing that distinguishes labour inspectors when they're going out, whether they're compliance officers focusing purely on health and safety, or whether they're officers dealing with a broader spectrum, or whether they're specialist inspectors like industrial hygienists dealing with something, those inspectors are in a position to actually make something happen, to make a change happen, and to make sure that the protection that the workers need can actually be put in place. And in order to be credible, the penalties, whether that's a notice, whether that's the inspector requiring something to be done, or it's much more serious and you end up in a courtroom, whatever happens should be in line with the gravity and the nature of what you find and the damage that has been caused. If damage has already happened, hopefully you can go in and prevent, but otherwise you want to be holding people to account appropriately. Different examples of ways in which people enforce the law across the globe. Pretty much all of the labour inspectorates I've encountered use persuasion. They use verbal advice as one of the options for really minor things. Just telling people that's not quite right, you really need to put that right, but it's a minor thing, then that's fine. Lots, you obviously put in writing, or use standard templates, standard forms in order to say these are the things that are wrong. Usually when they want to follow up and make sure that those things are put right. Some use legal notices. We certainly do that in the UK, and similarly Malaysia and Ireland and others that I've seen use notices in order to make things happen. In this country, we have two sorts of different notices. We have prohibition notices, which we use to stop something life-threatening from carrying on. So you know, if we see something that is fundamentally unsafe, somebody working on unprotected at height on an unprotected platform, for example, we would make sure that person was retrieved safely, and we would prohibit anybody working on that platform until the platform was safe and somebody couldn't actually fall off it. Then we use improvement notices to give the organisations an amount of time if we want them to put it right, but it's not immediately life-threatening, it's not going to cause immediate serious injury. So, for example, we might do that with health situations where the health controls are not quite right. What we might say to the employer is, look, this person's being exposed, for example, to 2-pack isocyanate paints because they're paint spraying. We expect you to take some immediate action to give them respiratory, but then we will give them time to put in more engineering controls at source, local exhaust ventilation, and other means of reducing the risk, which are not relying just on the last line of protection of the respiratory protective equipment. In some countries, certainly in the USA, some of the labour inspectors issue immediate fines for violations, and some of them are quite significant. The fines that are imposed, if you take a quick glance at OSHA's pages, you can see they record publicly some of the fines that they give, and they run into tens of thousands of dollars, or they issue citations where there's a problem. Lots of countries license some activities and may impose conditions on those licenses in order to more rigorously control something. Certainly many countries have that for particular activities like working with radiation or working with those who deal with asbestos or remove asbestos, if you have that in your country. But there may be something else certainly that you license in your country. And safety cases, that tends to be for the really high hazard, major hazard area. So many countries require, for example, offshore platforms or major chemical plants to produce very detailed cases about how they operate, how they maintain things, how they safeguard, and they have to get permission to operate the activity, to operate the plant. In terms of other sanctions, lots of countries apply cautions in different ways, and almost all the countries do have an option to prosecute in the criminal courts, and some take civil sanctions in the civil courts for really serious violations, things that are really grave. So that's a huge range of very flexible tools that inspectors, labour inspectors across the globe use in order to achieve the right outcome, which is control of the risk. Challenges to enforcing the law. I was asked to talk about challenges to enforcing the law. One of them we picked up on already. There are very few of us and lots of workplaces. So one of the challenges is just making sure there is a credible program of inspection and making sure that we respond properly to the most serious things. Clearly, training of inspectors, and I've put the link there to the IALI competency framework. Getting consistency of decisions is really important and quite a difficult thing to achieve in a labour inspectorate. And what I want to do is, I'll go forwards for a minute and then I'll come back again. I just want to give you an example of one of the ways. This is the way in the UK, an extract from the enforcement management model that we use, which tries to capture how we make regulatory decisions when we're out inspecting. So for example, if you saw a health and safety risk, the first step you decide to look at is, well, what are the priority issues here? And there might be a particular health issue in that organisation that you would look at. So if you went into woodworking, you'd be looking at dust inhalation, and there might be some machinery issues on spindle moulders and other machines in the business. You'd ask whether there was a risk of serious personal injury. If one of the woodworking machines wasn't properly guarded, you may prohibit its use until it is. If the health risk wasn't properly controlled, you may take some immediate action on the respiratory protection, but then serve an enforcement notice. You'd look at what the risk gap looked like. So what's the benchmark standard that they're supposed to be achieving? And that can be one of the challenges to enforcement, making sure there's a very clear standard that you're trying to achieve as a labour inspector and that the business understands as well. You can kind of establish then what you think your initial enforcement expectation is. The duty holder factors it refers to there is what kind of business is it? Is the business owner responding? Are they positive? Do they want to put it right? Are they resisting? Are they unhappy about it? In which case it may be more important to serve a formal notice to get them to do it because they don't really want to. And then you reach a kind of enforcement conclusion, which you then record. So this was purely by way of illustration, really, to give you a feel. But benchmarks, whether you have legal standards to do something or whether you have industry guidance or the regulator themselves has produced guidance in collaboration with the industry, that's really important for getting consistency of decisions among a group of inspectors all going out to deal with similar premises. Access to scientific and other support in terms of enforcing the law really important to be able to get the right support to take the action that you want to. Evidence gathering, that can be difficult. I spoke about witnesses disappearing. I'm sure others have experienced that when they've been trying to investigate. And sometimes getting the evidence that you need to understand what has happened and then to be able to really hold people to account for it can be really difficult. And of course, there's always the issue of people, which is a challenge to enforcing the law, and they may resist, they may appeal, they may want to complain, and that's all things that have to be dealt with. And of course, this was just by way of illustration in terms of what people will do misguidedly and the wrong kind of creativity, really, which is a challenge to us when we go in as labour inspectors, trying to help them put things right. So I can't emphasise strongly enough how important continual training is, or how important it is to have really good core procedures and core expectations around investigation and inspection activity for whatever topics, whatever specialism that you are doing. As I said, this is the link to the framework. And in terms of how we go about it, it's also important for us as labour inspectors to go about our work with a high standard of ethical conduct, making sure that we are having high standards of professionalism and that's what people see. So there is a global code of integrity, which is really useful. I make sure all my inspectors are aware of it and apply it. It has some really good values and expected behaviours in there, which I think we would all sign up to, and useful to be able to tell businesses, well, you know, I'm working in line with this global code of integrity. So I thought it was important that I gave you the link to that too. So I've gone on for a while there because I'm conscious of the time. I thought it might be useful for me to make sure I allowed enough time for you to ask some questions if you'd like to. So I will pause there and I will stop sharing that screen just in case anybody would like to ask any questions.
Wow, thank you so much, Samantha. That was well put together in about less than 45 minutes, well packed. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. I'm sure we all enjoyed ourselves. Definitely, I'm sure questions will come from all quarters. But I really like the part, the area you mentioned on the checklist, because most times we go on inspection or audit, and most times people want to walk around confining themselves to what they have in the checklist, and this does not allow to see beyond what we have on the checklist. So what was not captured on the checklist, if we see them, what do we do? Walk past them, even if they pose risks to the people. Yeah, I really like how you pull that up, and then the duty to investigate versus the power to investigate. Those are very strong, very strong words. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I also found out in some, from the training that we had, we found that countries with different regulations. So some talk about the right to enter place freely. Yes, some notify you before they come to your place. So I'm just wondering, notifying people before you get their workplaces, won't it, I mean, dilute the essence of the inspection? I mean, if I tell you I'm coming to your house to inspect how good or put together your house is, definitely you will put everything in proper perspective before I come. So I was just thinking, because and again you mentioned it here, I think in my perspective, from what you put across to her, it's better to always do the unannounced visits rather than notifying people I want to come to you. So you see the CEO dressed and even wearing hard hat inside his office and wearing goggles inside his office, which of course he doesn't really need, but just to impress the inspector. So thank you so much. I'm sure there will be more questions from my colleagues, and we can take it from here. So dear colleagues, questions, let's see, you can leave them in the chat room. Let's see if there are. Good. If you can only, okay, there's Ebenezer's hand is up. Ebenezer, your hand is up, so unmute your mic.
Okay, very good evening. And I want to thank our resource person for a wonderful presentation. I want to know whether globally, whether they also have the challenge whereby per our law, before you establish a factory, you are supposed to bring the drawings to us for us to look at it, whether all the safety procedures have been put in place before you go and then you even build. But normally people will build, start operating before you have to chase them to do the right thing. So sometimes they will tell you they don't know, even your entry, they begin to resist, question, trying to give you time. So I want to know how best, the best practices, how they're able to go about people having to even register their premises before they put up their factories, so that they know that inspectors are mandated to come and inspect them.
Well, what a wonderful power to have for a start, that people have to come to you with the plans, because that's a great opportunity to get them to put the right controls in right from the beginning, with depending on the kind of factory that they're planning to build. So we used to have a similar power in the UK, that they had to notify us before a factory started operating, but we left that behind quite a long time ago. Instead, we have quite a lot of laws around the construction of buildings and the purpose for which they are built. And we regulate that law, we regulate it via that route instead. And I think we're not alone in that. So I think quite a lot of countries have gone down that line. So what we call our construction design and management regulations begin right from the point of design. And there are very big responsibilities on the architects and those, the principal contractors involved, to make sure that the building is designed properly for the purpose for which it's being built. And if it's being built as a factory, then it would have to be built to the right standards for a factory. So I think there are some legal differences. It's quite hard to get people to register necessarily on time, as you're finding when you have that system. We found a similar problem. So I think actually it's maybe, even if they do come to you late, being able to intervene. The consequences for them, if you've got good enforcement powers, are just that they're going to have to do more than they would have probably had to do had they come to you in the first place and they'd done it at the right time. So, you know, you could be fearless about saying to them, well, you should have come to me earlier, you didn't, you now need to do this, this and this in order to have the right controls in place. I could have told you earlier before you'd, you know, wasted your time building what you've built. So I'm not quite sure how that helps, but I hope it does help give you a feel for the way in which others have approached that, by moving away from the register, but moving on to making sure that those that design the buildings understand the implications for health, safety and the welfare of those who will then use the building.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I think that was a very clear concern that my colleague from Ghana, Ebenezer, raised, because most times you find out that you can't really blame people who want to set up factories in your locality when you have no pre-operational laws that you give to them. These are the requirements, like looking at what are the requesting for document, like the environmental impact assessments and all have you, and the health impact assessment. So most times they are not guided because most of the laws that we have don't provide for them. So I think that's the more reason why we are thinking of repealing our laws, so that it can provide for these things before they happen. Assuming somebody is coming from whatever country it is, should have that document to look at, okay, what are the pre-requirements I need to meet before I set up a factory in this country. I remember many years ago, somebody called me from, I think, outside of Africa. They were coming to do audit in Nigeria. So they were looking for documents. What are the prerequisites? What are the standards? I just couldn't help him. I said, the truth is that, yeah, we have them in bits and pieces. So this is what we have the factory. I just use this. Well, it's quite shameful, but we are already on course on that right now to see how we can actually ensure that these things are in place, so that we don't remove laws. We don't have laws in our homes. Then somebody will come to live with us and mess up our home. We now say, okay, we'll take you to court. There are no laws. Where there is no law, there is no offense. So thank you so much for all that. Then we have my colleague from South Africa, Nolala. Your hand has been up since. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Good evening, colleagues. Thanks, Samantha, for a very informative presentation. I think OSHAfrica is growing. I can see some similar faces, on the webinar, which is quite interesting. Samantha, my question is around the informal sector. And however, I'm tempted to ask a question, maybe in your line of work, if you have dealt with the issues of language barrier, because it's something that I've been struggling with here in South Africa. We have our do we call them investors? Okay, investors from China, working in our country. And in terms of our scope, there are limitations in terms of, enforcing our legislation due to language, barrier. And maybe if you have dealt with it, because in our country, they are protected by our constitution. And it's very difficult, for us to communicate with them in English, because they will say, no, I don't understand English, and all my English is finished now. I don't understand what you are saying. Which makes it difficult for us to enforce, our legislation.
Yeah.
And secondly, I have two questions. Secondly, it's on the informal sector, because that is where I think that sector has been neglected for a very long time. And my experience is that there are sort of like diseases that are emanating from that sector due to, the unsafe working environment. You'll find people, selling vegetables on the street. And when you look at the condition of the environment that they are operating in, it's not conducive. And for them, it's between life and death. And it's very, 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 very difficult to enforce in that area, because I would term it maybe lack of education or lack of awareness. How best can we deal with, informal sector maybe in Africa? I think I'm speaking this for my other colleagues who may be, facing the very same challenges, because informal sector, we are very struggling in that aspect. Thank you, Ehi. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Cheers. So I think the language issue, you are not alone. I think every country now, including the UK, has a mix of languages operating. We have, not far from where I live in England, we have police officers who now have learned to speak Polish because they need to speak Polish, because a huge section of the working population in agriculture speaks Polish and they don't speak English. So you're right. I think that's a really interesting challenge. One of the things that we had to do for our inspectors now is we have an on the phone line translation service for them, so that when they do encounter employers whose first language is, either Chinese or Punjabi or, another language, and they have a very limited understanding of English, we have to have a translator line so that the inspectors can actually convey what it is they need to convey. Now, that's not easy. It's not easy to provide that just easily or everywhere. But certainly we have tried to really encourage employers, if they're employing a workforce without English as a first language, to make sure that they translate key information and documents into the language, but more universally try to use pictorial information to educate people, try to use pictures to educate them rather than words, to make sure they understand what we're asking them to do. But I think it is a really acute challenge. And it's also difficult holding people to account when they're outside your territorial boundaries, as well as maybe your law. We have quite a few areas, for example, construction jobs, huge infrastructure jobs, where actually the people in charge of it may be based in another country. And so actually reaching out and making sure you can hold them accountable is not straightforward. And there are ways and means of trying to cooperate and collaborate with other labour inspectorates in order to get that done. But it's not straightforward. I think in the informal sector, that's probably something, as you say, you've probably got colleagues on this call who are in a really good position to maybe say some of the ideas that they've done. That's clearly not something I have seen yet with the labour inspectorates that I've had contact with, that particular example that you're giving, but your colleagues on the call may have had some ideas about how to handle that.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Samantha. I have our colleague from Zimbabwe, Elinga. Are you still here?
Thank you very much, Ehi, and thank you, Samantha, for that insightful presentation. Unfortunately, I also don't have a response for the informal sector issue because it's also a huge challenge for us in Zimbabwe. But the reason why I raised my hand is because I have a different question altogether. I wanted to ask with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. Yes, you find that when the pandemic hit and the country went into total lockdown, though there were some essential services or some workplaces that were defined as essential services that continued operating despite the total lockdown. We had a huge challenge as a regulatory authority in terms of how best to proceed in terms of conducting workplace inspections, because, you know, there was this fear from the inspectors themselves to say if we go into workplaces, we might expose ourselves. And there was also a fear from the employers themselves to say if we allow an inspector into our premises, are we not exposing our workers? So I wanted to find out from you, Samantha, in terms of that issue, how you managed to address that issue during those times of the total lockdown, in case maybe we have another similar pandemic that may force countries to impose total lockdowns on workplaces. How did you proceed during those times? Thank you.
Yeah, so like that's a really good question as well. So probably like yourselves, we knew that there would be workplaces we would have to go to. There would be deaths we would have to investigate, you know, not just COVID deaths, but conventional deaths. People were still on construction sites. They were still working in factories producing food. So those were places where we knew we would still need to go and do the work that we do. We tried to minimize what we were having to do for a period of time, but nonetheless, we still went out. So what we did was to make sure that our inspectors, who are very well equipped anyway, were actually equipped with all of the sanitizers, all of the things that they might require in order to keep themselves very clean. We assessed those risks to our inspectors and made sure that the 2-meter separation that they had to have, that was maintained all times when they were inspecting. So we minimized their time inside places. You know, we would make sure they were doing a dynamic assessment of the environment that they were in. They're quite highly trained, so they knew what to look for. They knew that you know, if they walked into a room and it was stuffy, they were going to walk straight back out again from that area and observe differently. So we equipped them with a series of behaviours and controls that we expected them to apply, and we equipped them with the kit to be able to keep themselves really clean. And actually, despite going out and doing all the inspections and all the investigations that we did, we only had 3 or 4 cases across the whole of the inspectorate in the space of about 18 months. So we managed to do, you know, quite a lot to safeguard. And we had people making sure that they were isolating for a little while if they were going to the more difficult areas like offshore. And we had testing if people were going offshore, because those are closed communities and, you know, you do not want to import something into there, and it's very difficult to get somebody off an offshore platform if they fall ill. So we worked really closely with the industry, which were taking care of its own people anyway, to make sure that our inspectors also played their part in making sure they were following those, but that we could still carry on with essential work when we needed to. So yeah, it was really a case of assessing the risks as an employer, as a good employer, and then making sure that we gave our inspectors the right, very clear expectations about what they would and wouldn't do and how to go about it, and the materials to keep themselves very clean whilst they were moving around. So I hope that helps. We had to do what any other employer was doing, I think, really, which was to try and not cross-infect as we were going about the essential work.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. Any other question? Dear colleagues, questions from any other quarter? I've looked through the chat room. There are no questions.
No.
It means we all enjoyed ourselves to a great deal. That's what it means. So if there are no further questions, Samantha, there was a question, someone asking if we can share these slides to them.
Absolutely.
Do you have any reservation?
No, I'm very happy if you would like to share the slides.
Okay. We share this slide with everybody that attended this register for this webinar. Okay, I think it's been an evening well spent. A whole lot we had to learn, and I'm happy to hear. I mean, some of the challenges we have here, we thought they were peculiar to us. Actually, I'm so happy to hear that you also are dealing with such challenges. I mean, that's what makes the world a better place. We need to learn from each other. So, what would have assumed? While sitting here in Nigeria, my colleagues seated in Zimbabwe and the one in South Africa, thinking, oh, we are the only ones that have this problem. But it's so good to know that you are also dealing with this also. And Samantha, it's been a very wonderful presentation delivered here, and I think we are all we had a lot to benefit from it. But the truth is that this is not the last time we'll come to you. You have become a common face in Africa after this presentation. So we will be coming back to you, and maybe we want to learn from your wealth of experience. While we're doing this, we believe exchange of knowledge make the whole world better. We talk about globalization, and we should know what happens. Challenges you had, how you dealt with them. So if we know how you dealt with them, we have no need to reinvent the wheels. We just look at it from where you picked it from and the formula and the approaches you used. Then we just also apply same and see how we can manage ours. But it's been a very great time. I mean, for me, it's been a very productive evening for me. If this was all I did for today, I think it's a very fulfilling day for me. But while we're doing this, really, we look forward to a workplace in Africa. We're not saying we're looking for a workplace that'll be void of risk. A workplace where the risk will be reduced to a barest minimum. A workplace that we can send our loved ones to will have the hope that they will return home the way they went to work. But we have a series of issues where people go to work. If they don't get injured, they have what you call accumulated occupational health exposure. And at the time they start manifesting, most times we are not even able to trace those things to their workplaces. But with the knowledge we've had today and the exchange of information, learning from different countries' perspective, I think this has been a very excellent moment. All we have to do is to go back to our workplaces, go back to our countries, our localities, and see how we can implement the knowledge we have shared in this place today. One thing is for us to learn, another thing is for us to be able to implement what we have learned. If we cannot implement what we have learned, then we haven't learned. And that is how the philosopher puts it. So it's our responsibility to go back to our workplaces, see what best we can do. We can't solve the whole problem, but in your zone of influence, the seat you'll be given, the role you play, the title you bear, act along those titles positively with human face at the back of your mind. So thank you so much, everybody. This is where we'll draw the curtain. It's been an hour, 11 minutes well spent. Samantha, please, our love to our colleagues from IALI. Please, it was a very great thing they did for us, for allowing you to come and make presentation. So before we go, I'll just leave you, if you have a parting word for our people, so that we'll just hear from you, then we can close the meeting afterwards.
Thanks very much. And can I just say thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging and asking questions. I learn as much from you as you do from me. I think your point, is absolutely bang on. Labour inspectors need to talk to each other all of the time. We need to learn from one another. We need to help one another, to constantly just improve and evolve and meet the challenges that face us. And the world is constantly changing, and those challenges are constantly changing too. So I've been really delighted to meet you all and to speak with you all. It's lovely to meet fellow labour inspectors, all of us share a common mission, which is to keep people alive, to keep them safe, to make them not die when they go to work. You know, they need to come home from work safe and healthy as they did when they went there. So we have a mission together, don't we? And we can help one another as we go forward. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you again, I hope one day.
Surely one day we'll see physically when this phase is finally over. Thank you so much. And my dear colleagues, brothers and sisters, thank you so much for being here. If Samantha has come here and facing only Ehi, it would have been called a webinar. It's called a webinar because Samantha was here, Ehi was here moderating the program, and there were people who were willing to sacrifice that time to listen. Thank you so much, and wish you all a wonderful evening and happy night rest. God bless you all, and bye.
Bye-bye. God bless you too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.